Consider supporting this podcast on Patreon. On this episode of the What is Asia podcast, I interview Kharis Ralph, a history Ph.D. student at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, to talk about protest music in Korea in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Kharis, thanks for joining us on this episode of the What is Asia podcast.
Thanks for having me.
I wanted to start off by asking a question about sort of your methods and how you got started with this idea. You talk about the history of Korean music from the 1970s, right, until the 1990s. And I think it can be a useful point of information for graduate students who are maybe just starting out in their MA program or just starting out in their PhD program, or they're getting ready to apply for a PhD, and they're still in search for the topic that's right for them. I was wondering if you can go a little bit into how you discovered your topic, how you knew that that was the right topic for you, and if you could just sort of talk about what that process of discovery looked like.
It was actually very serendipitous. I feel like a lot of people who start like being interested in like Korean cultural stuff, like they come in through like a K-pop thing. So I already had like a sort of like a background more generally in terms of popular music in Korea. And then like when I was trying to think of my topic, a lot of people like look at like literature or art, but then like most people looking at music, like they're more in like ethnomusicology or in musicology. And so I was fortunate enough in my master's program that I actually had a professor whose like speciality was like Korean ethnomusicology. And so I was working with him, and that's how I stumbled upon my topic, or just a more interest in music more generally. And I was living in Korea in 2016 to learn the language. And that was also the time when there were mass protests against the government of Park Geun-hye. So I also got to see those protests and how they were unfolding. And, they always had musicians on stage performing. And it was only later that I realized that some of these songs, at least, were performed from the 1980s. And so my interest in like music and history and how music is mobilized to suit present needs. That's how it started.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I guess, do you have any thoughts for students who might be like starting out in that searching process or finding a topic that works for them? Did you learn anything along the way that maybe you'd want to pass on to any of those students?
I would say just be open to any type of possibility, because originally, I had actually gone into my master's program thinking about the comfort women issue. And it just happened that like the first course I ever took was about Korean democracy. And it started out as a term paper, and then I just expanded it. So I guess it would just be try anything. And in terms of like coursework, I know this is like more like a practical, very, very practical type of advice, but like in terms of coursework, don't be afraid to like branch out into different departments and try things just seem interesting, even if they don't necessarily relate to what you think you want to do.
You talk about music from the 70s, 80s, and early 90s as being a form of political protest. So I'm wondering if you can sort of set the scene first and talk about what did Korea look like politically at this time. My audience will know when I interviewed Rob York a few months back that things were very laden with trouble during the 1950s, just coming out of the Korean War. Did things look differently in the 70s and 80s compared to the 1950s? Did they look the same? And just if it did change, in what ways did it evolve, and how did Korea look during that time?
Yeah, so as you said, like there was like a very difficult period coming out of the Korean War. And so what do you have, as you said, like 1950s, 1960s, like it's technically a democracy, but not really. And so you actually have a slew of dictators. So the first dictator was taken out in 1960, and then like there was like a hope that now finally we would have like more democratic reforms. But then there's a coup d'état under Park Chung-hee, and like he's the dictator who oversees like the economic development in Korea. And so he's kind of a contentious figure because like the argument is basically like two camps, as per usual, where it's well, economic development is great. That's why Korea is where it is now. But then, so people like him for that reason. But then the other side of it, like, what's the cost? And like, there were so many like repressions in like freedom of expression, and like there were a lot of like people dying in like factories because like there were no protections at all, and it was everything was just invested to improve the economy. But if the economy doesn't help people, like what's the point if it's only being amassed in like the top echelons of society? And so he ends up getting assassinated in 1979, I believe, and then a new dictator takes over in the 1980s. But then in the 1980s, if we just think more globally, so you also see like that's also like steadily like the fall of like, or like weakening of like global communism in terms of like the Eastern Bloc. And then you also have also other types of democracy movements pushing forward throughout Asia, and like in Taiwan and the Philippines. And so like it's under him that like pop culture starts to like get more free, but there's still a lot of controls. And throughout this whole time, there was a like a democracy movement in place. But it was only in the 1980s, once we had this huge massacre of like civilians in Gwangju, that it really impels this newer generation of student activists to become more vocal and more militant in what they were doing. And so that's how the pro-democracy movement happens. And then in 1987, that's when you have the transition to democracy.
Hmm. And you talk about this phenomenon called the Minjung Movement, and you also use this term Minjung Kayo. Can you talk a little bit about what those terms mean and how they connect to the politics of the time?
So Minjung literally translates as like the people. And this became almost like it was like the main intellectual cultural like impulse behind the pro-democracy movement in the 1980s. And what these activists were doing, like especially if you look at like what was happening in the universities, is that they were trying to present through the lens of the Minjung, through the people, an alternate telling of Korean history as opposed to what was being espoused by the state. And so what the state was doing was that like, oh, like we're the ones who've saved the nation, we're the protagonists, and you do what we tell you to do. And so a lot of these students were mobilizing this idea of Minjung, the people, that no, our history does not belong in the state. It does not reside in the state. Rather, it's the people who've propelled history forward. And so Minjung became a type of like retroactive way of looking at, I don't know, retroactive lens and looking through history. And so now instead of like state initiatives being like the main markers of like important events in Korean history, it became what were the moments where the people rose and like rebelled and like ushered in change. And so it's a very revolutionary type of category. And related to this is this idea of Minjung Kayo, and Kayo means song, so it's like Minjung songs, songs of the people. And during the pro-democracy movement, there were a slew of like intellectual, like musician activists who were trying to compose music, not just for use in protests or use in rallies, but they were actually influenced by Marxism. And so they were trying to think of how music can change society for the better. And so that's the type of music that they were composing.
Can you give us maybe a little more of a look into who some of these singers were, the influence that they had on political movements, and maybe some specific issues that they were singing about?
Yeah, so this is also what I'm still like trying to figure out more generally, because what I realized is that when people talk about this past, and like they in the 1980s, they refer to something called the 노래운동. Sorry, my accent is really Anglo, but it literally means like song movement. And like as soon as you tap on like movement to anything, it sounds like it's like really big and like it's really important. But then I realized that actually like there's two things going on where you have like more generally in the 1980s, you have people wanting to mobilize music. So you have more like workers circles coming up with like really like military sounding like oh like the day has come, or like it's a very like march like militaristic sounding stuff. But then you also have student activists who are also trying to compose things for rallies. So I guess like it would be more like what you would think protest music is like this is what we want to see, and like just in terms of the lyrics, it's very very militant, very like anti-government, and then like you also have a lot of commemorative songs of like past democracy martyrs coming out. So there's that general idea of like the song movement. But then there's also a group of people that I call the song movement, uppercase S, uppercase M, who were actually like a core group of intellectuals writing about what they wanted music to be. And so it was this group, this smaller group based in Seoul, who were the ones really influenced by Marxism. And like if we're thinking about, if I'm going to drop some names, it's like Adorno, and in terms of like how music can change consciousness, and music as an independent being that can affect change. Like that's how they were talking about music. And so contrary to the very protest specific songs that are more militant, they wanted to compose songs of everyday life that would change consciousness that way. And so they were more, I think like folk sounding music, Bob Dylan-esque, like that was their aesthetic. So like obviously that's easier to listen to. So it became really popular in the early 1990s. But since then, you know, generations have changed. K-pop has taken over. So it's not as popular anymore.
Mm-hmm. And one thing that I was struck by in the materials that you sent me is you talk about how some of these singers have made something of a comeback in their music and their performance. People who were making songs back in the 80s are coming back in 2016, 2017 and on, and singing their music again. From the research that you've done, do these singers still hold a considerable amount of influence in Korean society? And as an extension to that question, in what way, if at all, has their music sort of taken on new political connotation, or is their music just strictly a callback to the political issues of the time when they wrote that song?
Yeah, so this is what I'm looking at right now. So it's still in development. But what was really interesting, so you have these very iconic songs from the 1980s, and one of them is like Morning Dew. 긴 밤지 새우고 불림마다 맺힌 진주보다 더 고운 아침 이슬처럼. Evergreen tree, and like they've almost become like the classical canon of like pro-democracy protests. So, like they always just like resurface again at these moments of like mass civilian action. And so like they popped up again in the 2016-2017 candlelight rallies against the president Park Geun-hye, who was actually the daughter of the dictator back in the 1970s. So like you have like this like weird like historical connection there. So it's actually kind of fun, that you're protesting against the daughter of this dictator who had actually banned this song back in the day. So like there's a lot of like symbolic things going on there. But like as I was like looking into this topic more closely, what I find really interesting is that like by folk, what you see, you have these iconic songs from the past and they're sung in the present. So obviously they were calling this longer history of people's struggle, to give legitimacy and like strength behind the movement. But like what sometimes like these iconic songs do, and it's more like iconic songs, not the singers who sang them necessarily. But what this focus on the iconic songs does is actually it almost dampens the fact that there are other activist singers who have like been steadily since the 1980s until the present still been active. And so like there's also like more songs that are being used in the present for present purposes and like for present labor struggles that just because of the sheer force and volume of these iconic songs, like they don't get heard as much. So like for sure you have, this is a really long extended answer, but like for sure you have like musical activists from the 1980s who are still present and like doing stuff in the 2016, 2017 kind of like rallies. But like for a lot of like the big famous names, this is always like the fact where you have like I guess it's like the very classic struggle between, oh, like will you go for politicization or for commercialization? And so like there's also like that strong divide even within how we think about popular music and what is possible politically. So those types of singers who've gone more mainstream are not necessarily affiliated as closely with activist musical scene anymore.
Mm-hmm. And of course, nowadays when we think about Korean music, obviously the big one is BTS, and people think about K-pop. But I guess could you recommend one or two of these songs that may be available on YouTube or some
Oh,
streaming service? And I don't know if there's an English translation. If there's not, I can post a couple of links to that in the description of this video. But
sure.
would there be a couple of songs that you would recommend people listen to sort of get familiar with this topic that we're talking about? Because often it can be difficult to talk about music without sort of having a reference point for understanding it.
Yeah, for sure. So like like there's one composer who's his name's Kim Min Ki. I can also like type it to you later, but he has like two songs in particular that are like really reminiscent of like the pro democracy struggle back then. And the translations are Morning Dew, 아침 이슬, and then Evergreen Tree, 상록수.
저들의 푸르른 솔잎을 보라 돌보는 사람도 하나 없는데.
So those are the more, I would say, like folk inspired type things. So like they're more like the music of everyday life. And then there's another one, I forgot the one who composed it, but it comes out of this 1980 massacre that I talked about before. And it was like a song commemorating what had happened and like talking about like the struggle will continue. And like that's the more militaristic sounding thing. And it's called March for a Lover.
Yeah, we can post a couple of links for that in the description below for people to listen to. And just the last question that I have is, this is obviously not really a topic that most people would think about when they think about post-war Korea, but if someone's listening to this and they do want to know more about the period of the 70s through 90s in Korea, or if they want to know more about this protest music, is there any literature out there that you can recommend for someone to sort of dive a little more into this topic?
The thing is, this is actually kind of like a newer topic. So there aren't that many English sources. Like it's started like steadily happening. I think there's So I'm sorry, I can't really recommend English sources because there aren't really any. But there's a movie that you can watch. It's called 1987, and it's about like this pro-democracy struggle. And like if you listen to the soundtrack, you can actually hear some of these songs that I've been talking about.
Great. Kharis, thank you for joining us on this episode of the What is Asia podcast.
Thank you for having me.
And for those who are interested in viewing more content, you can go to the What is Asia podcast YouTube channel or nakotadefonso.com. We'll see you next time.
긴 밤시 새우고 불림마다 맺힌 진주보다 더 고운 아침 이슬처럼